Rain had stopped an hour ago, but the plywood still held the smell of it. Jake Sullivan stood at the edge of the scaffolding platform, clipboard against his forearm, watching Kate Simmons study the blueprints spread across a folding table below. String lights from the fundraiser tent glowed orange behind her. A man from the Chamber of Commerce passed close, slowed, gave them both a look that lingered a beat too long, then smiled and walked on. Jake felt it too. He stepped back half a pace. "Careful," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "People would think we're together." Kate didn't look away. Would that be so bad? Neither of them answered. The river kept moving behind them, the way it always had. Before the story unfolds, sit with that question for a second. What would you have said back if you were standing where he was standing? 6 weeks earlier, the Arkansas River still carried the color of October gray-green at the edges, deceptively calm, the kind of current that only revealed its speed once you'd already stepped too close. On the north bank, a chain-link fence stretched along 4 acres of cleared lots where Riverside Commons was supposed to rise. A public promenade, retail space along the water, and a footbridge meant to connect 2 neighborhoods that hadn't had a reason to speak to each other in 30 years. It had been her father's dream before it was hers, sketched on the back of a napkin 2 decades ago, and handed down along with a company name and a debt load that didn't sleep. Simmons' Riverside Group was 3 months behind on the Phase 2 permitting, and the site supervisor who had run the crew since groundbreaking had quit without warning, citing his heart and his doctor in the same breath. Kate needed someone who could read a structural drawing without needing it explained twice. Someone who could start Monday, someone who wouldn't ask a lot of questions about why the schedule had gone from tight to impossible. Jake Sullivan fit 2 of those requirements. The third one, he broke on his very first afternoon. He showed up to the interview in a canvas jacket with a torn cuff, 40 minutes early, and sat in his truck in the parking lot until the exact minute of his appointment before walking in. Kate's assistant handed her his 1-page resume, no cover letter, a work history that jumped from a defunct engineering firm straight into a decade of residential remodels, with no clear line drawn between them and Kate, almost set it aside for that gap alone. Then she noticed the margin notes he'd made on the site plan she'd emailed him the night before. Small, exact corrections in pencil, a load calculation flagged with a question mark, and a number that, when she checked it later, turned out to be right. She hired him on a 90-day contract before she'd finished her coffee, and told herself it was because of the notes and nothing else. Her assistant, on the way out of the office that afternoon, mentioned that the reference he'd listed a small residential remodeling outfit 2 counties over had described him in exactly 4 words. Shows up, does it right. No embellishment, no story attached to the gap in his history. Kate found that more convincing than a glowing paragraph would have been. His morning started before 6, in a small rented house on the east side of Tulsa, packing a lunch for his daughter Grace while she narrated, at length and with great seriousness, the plot of a book she was reading about a dog who solved neighborhood crimes. Jake listened the way he did most things now, fully, without hurrying her toward the door. He tied her shoes when she let him, which was rarer now that she was 9, and insisted she could do it herself, badly, taking twice as long as necessary. He never rushed that either. At the sight he became someone else. Not colder, just contained, like a man who had learned exactly how much of himself was safe to bring to work. He walked the perimeter of the excavation each morning before the crew clocked in, checking stakes and grade markers against a mental map he seemed to carry without needing the plans in hand. When Kate came out for her first full walkthrough, boots too new for the mud still clinging to the soles, she watched him catch a rebar spacing error. The crew liked him fast, the way crews learn to like a supervisor who doesn't waste their morning on speeches. He kept a thermos of black coffee on the tailgate for anyone who forgot theirs, remembered which of the younger guys were still learning to read a level, and never made a show of correcting them in front of the others. By the end of the first week, nobody was calling him the new guy anymore. "You used to do this for a living," she said. It wasn't a question. "Long time ago," Jake said, and moved on to the next stake before she could ask which living, exactly, or why he'd walked away from it. That night, at her kitchen table with the day's mail unopened beside her, Kate found herself writing his name into the small leather notebook she kept for things worth remembering, a habit from her father, one she rarely used for anyone on the crew. She didn't examine why she'd made an exception for him. She closed the notebook, told herself it was about the rebar, and knew, even as she thought it, that it wasn't only that. 20 or 30 words came and went between them most days after that. Nothing more, a question about grade, a note about weather delays, and the small mechanics of a job site, finding its rhythm around a new supervisor. It should have stayed there. It didn't, not entirely, but neither of them said so out loud yet. Kate's father, in the years before he died, had a rule about hiring. Watch how a man treats the people who can do nothing for him. She'd seen Jake crouch to explain a grading stake to the newest laborer on the crew, a 19-year-old kid nobody else bothered to slow down for, taking the same care with him that he'd taken correcting a firm out of Dallas. She hadn't told anyone she'd noticed. She noticed anyway, every time. The technical review meeting for Phase 2 ran long, the way it always did when the Dallas firm's junior engineer tried to defend a calculation he hadn't checked twice. Jake sat at the back of the conference room, arms crossed, saying nothing, until the numbers projected on the screen stopped adding up to anything he could stay quiet about. "That live load figure's off," he said. Not loud. The room went still anyway. "You're using the retail occupancy factor across the whole footprint. Second floor's residential adjacent, different code section entirely." The junior engineer flipped through his binder, found the discrepancy buried 3 pages in, and went pale in front of the whole room. Kate watched from the head of the table, arms folded, letting Jake finish without interrupting. The way she'd learned already meant more to him than agreement would have. A younger engineer near the window, new hire, still carrying the kind of enthusiasm the industry hadn't ground down yet, squinted at Jake like he was trying to place a face out of a textbook. "Wait," he said. "Sullivan Marsh. Did you co-write the load path retrofit paper? We studied that in grad school. I thought you'd retired or something." Jake didn't answer right away. He closed his binder, slow, deliberate, the way a man closes a door he does not want to slam in front of witnesses. "Different lifetime," he said, and that was the end of it out loud, though not in the room, where 3 other people had heard the name too and were already reaching for their phones under the table. The Dallas firm's senior partner, dialed in on speaker for the rest of the meeting, went quiet for long enough that Kate had to check the call hadn't dropped. When he finally spoke again, his tone had changed, entirely less territorial, more careful, the voice of a man recalculating who exactly he was in the room with. Jake didn't seem to notice, or didn't let it show if he did. He was already back to reviewing the drainage plan on the next page. Kate caught him afterward, in the hallway outside, holding 2 cups of coffee she hadn't asked whether he wanted. "You co-wrote a method they teach in graduate school," she said, quiet enough not to carry, "and now you're checking rebar spacing for a company that pays you by the day." Jake took the coffee without drinking it. "There are things I'm not free to talk about," he said. "Not because I don't want to. Legally not free. The short version is true. Though I need to be near my daughter more than I need to be near a drafting table." It wasn't the whole truth. It also wasn't a lie. And Kate, who had spent a career learning the difference between the two in boardrooms full of people who blurred them on purpose, didn't push any further. She thought about it anyway, alone in her office that night, pulling his application file from the drawer where new hire paperwork waited to be scanned into the system. Under reason for leaving previous position, someone, Jake, in his own tight handwriting, had started to write something, then struck it through so hard the pen had torn clean through the paper. She couldn't read what it said. She could see exactly how much it had cost him to cross it out, and that told her more than the sentence itself would have. She closed the file and put it back precisely where she'd found it, and told herself she would ask him properly when the moment was right, and meant it. Outside her window, the crew was packing up for the day, and she watched Jake for a moment longer than the paperwork required. The way he checked the tie-downs on the equipment twice before calling it finished a man who didn't trust anything, including himself, until he'd verified it with his own hands. Riverside had sponsored the district's STEM night for 3 years running, long before Kate had any reason to think about the man walking a school gymnasium in work boots, carrying a paper plate of cookies. He clearly hadn't wanted but couldn't politely refuse. She was there because the company logo hung on the banner behind the volcano displays, because her father used to say a business owed its city more than its tax dollars, and because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays like this one were hers to give away. She found Jake at the edge of a folding table where his daughter's project sat, a model bridge built from popsicle sticks and wood glue, tested that morning with a plastic bucket of pennies until it finally gave way under a weight Grace had recorded with visible pride in a marbled composition notebook. "You must be the sponsor lady," Grace said, before either adult managed a proper introduction. "Dad said you're his boss. Are you going to fire him if his bridge is bad?" It held 2 pounds more than the winning table, Kate said, crouching to Grace's eye level, studying the little structure like it mattered as much as anything on her desk downtown. "I think his job's safe for now." Grace beamed like she'd built it entirely on her own, which mostly she had. Jake stood a few feet back, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the two of them with an expression Kate hadn't seen on him at the sight, something unguarded and easy, the version of a man that only came out around his own kitchen table and, apparently, gymnasiums crowded with volcanoes and trifold posters. "She gets the stubbornness from her mother," Jake said, when Grace ran off to compare notes with a friend from her class. "The bridge building, though that might be me." Kate looked at the little structure a moment longer. "It's a good bridge," she said, and meant more by it than the plywood and glue in front of her. A teacher stopped by the table to compliment the design, then lingered a second too long looking between Jake and Kate before moving on to the next project, the way people had started to do lately, without either of them quite naming it. Jake caught it and let it go. Kate caught it too, and didn't. "Popsicle sticks hold more weight than people think," Jake said, mostly to fill the space the teacher had left behind. "Same principle as steel, just slower to fail. You get warning signs first, if you're paying attention." "Is that a metaphor?" Kate asked. "Or an engineering fact? Depends which one you need tonight." Later, walking to her car under a sky gone the color of a fresh bruise, Kate thought about how little of that easy, unguarded man ever made it to the job site. She thought, too, about the phrase he'd used. Back at the trailer that served as the site office the next morning, Jake pulled the Phase 1 inspection binder to prepare a summary for the city, an old habit of thoroughness he'd never managed to turn off, even when nobody was asking him to be careful. He found the foundation certification page and scanned the signature block out of pure reflex. The date was off by 9 days from every other document in the sequence. Small. The kind of thing that meant nothing, most of the time, in most binders, on most projects. He told himself that, filed the binder back where it belonged, and went out to check the day's concrete pour, and didn't entirely believe himself the whole walk out there. The two of them stayed past 9 that night, working through the Phase 2 structural package line by line ahead of the resubmission deadline, takeout containers going cold between stacks of drawings that neither of them had the heart to reheat. Jake pulled the foundation certification again, the one with the date that had been sitting wrong in the back of his mind for a week, and this time cross-referenced the stamp against the city's list of approved inspection vendors. The firm's stamp didn't match any registered inspector on that list. Not an expired license, not a clerical slip he could talk himself out of. A name that, as far as the city of Tulsa was concerned, did not currently do business within its limits. He didn't say anything yet. He wanted to be certain before he handed Kate a problem he couldn't fully explain, on top of everything else already sitting on her desk. She noticed him go quiet over the drawings and asked what was wrong. He said it was nothing, a formatting question he'd get sorted, and changed the subject by asking about her father, an easy deflection, because she never needed much invitation to talk about him. She told him about the man who'd built Simmons Riverside out of a 2-person office, and a truck with his own name hand-painted on the door, who used to bring her to job sites on Saturday mornings, and let her hold the level like it was something sacred. "I inherited a company half the industry still thinks I don't deserve yet," she said, not quite looking at him. "Some days I halfway believe them." Jake looked up from the drawings. "You corrected a rebar spacing error on your first walkthrough. In heels. They were flats. Still counts." She rubbed her eyes, the kind of tired that came from more than one late night in a row. "My father used to say the job never asks what you're wearing, only whether you were paying attention." "Sounds like a man I would have liked working for." "He was hard to work for," Kate said. "Easy to love. Not always at the same time." She told him about the first ribbon cutting she remembered. A strip mall on the edge of town that felt, at 8 years old, like the biggest building in the world. Her father had let her hold the oversized scissors, even though the mayor's aide clearly hadn't planned for a child to be involved. He said if I was going to inherit the company someday, I might as well start practicing, she said. I didn't understand yet that inheriting a company mostly means inheriting everyone's doubts about whether you deserve it. "You've corrected more errors on this site in 6 weeks than the last 3 supervisors combined," Jake said. "That's not doubt anybody should still be carrying. Try telling the board that." "I did," Jake said. "This afternoon. In writing." Kate looked up at that, surprised. Something in her chest loosening she hadn't expected to feel over a stack of structural drawings on a Tuesday night. She laughed, surprised by it. And for a moment, the exhaustion went out of both their faces at once. He almost told her then about the paper, about Marsh, about the reason his hands still remembered every load path, even after he'd sworn off ever drawing one again. Instead, he said, quieter. "I used to think I could keep people safe with numbers alone. Turns out the numbers only work if somebody in charge is actually willing to listen to them." It wasn't the whole story. Kate heard the weight underneath it anyway, and didn't ask him to carry the rest of it out loud before he was ready. They sat with the quiet a while, drawings between them, the river outside gone black and silver under a thin half-moon. "There's a fundraiser Saturday," she said finally, folding a sheet closed. "Riverside throws it every year, halfway point of the build. Bring Grace. She's earned a night off from volcano judging." He said he'd think about it, which both of them understood, without saying so, to mean yes. The tent went up on the same stretch of bank where the footbridge would eventually stand, string lights crossing overhead in loose triangles, a local four-piece playing something with a fiddle woven through it. Grace ran laps between the dessert table and a cluster of kids from her class, breathless, narrating something about the dog detective's latest case to anyone patient enough to listen, which turned out to be most of the crowd within about 10 minutes. Jake watched her go, coffee in hand, feeling the particular relief of a parent who has, for one evening, stopped being the only source of his child's joy. Kate found him near the edge of the tent, out from under the lights where the noise thinned out, and the two of them fell into a conversation that didn't need an opening line to start it. She asked about his knee, which he'd been favoring all week on site without saying why. He asked about her father's old truck, still parked in a garage she kept locked and never opened, not even to look at it. Grace's laugh carried over from the dessert table, and both of them turned toward it at the same moment, then turned back to find each other already smiling before either one noticed doing it. "You could open the garage sometime," Jake said. "Doesn't have to mean anything. Just air the place out." "I know," Kate said. "I'm not there yet." "No rush," she said, and something about the way he said it made it clear he meant it, that he wasn't the kind of man who kept a ledger of how long other people took to be ready. A man Kate had known since business school passed close on his way to the bar, slowed, took in the two of them standing a little closer together than colleagues usually stood, and gave them a look with one eyebrow raised before moving on, saying nothing out loud, saying everything with his face. Jake felt it land the way weather lands, all at once. He stepped back half a pace. "Careful," he said. "People would think we're together." "Would that be so bad?" Kate said, and didn't look away. Neither of them answered that either, not that night, not out loud. But walking Grace to the car afterward, headlights sweeping across the gravel lot, Jake told Kate about the foundation certification, the vendor who wasn't registered anywhere, the date that didn't line up with anything else in the file. He hadn't planned to say it there in a parking lot, with his daughter half asleep across the back seat. It came out anyway, because he trusted her with it, and trusting anyone with something like that was new enough that he noticed himself doing it. Kate went quiet, then serious, all the warmth of the evening folding down into something steadier. "We check it properly before either of us says a word to anybody," she said. "No accusations until we actually know." He nodded. It was the answer he'd hoped for, and hadn't quite let himself expect from someone with as much to lose as she had. From the far edge of the tent, half in shadow near the parking lot lights, Dennis Reeves watched the two of them walk away. Together, the supervisor everyone on site had quietly started deferring to, the CEO who used to run every decision past him first without fail. He finished his drink slower than he wanted to, and told himself it was nothing. He didn't believe that any more than Jake had believed, a week earlier, that a 9-day date discrepancy meant nothing at all. Jenks sat 20 minutes south along the river, close enough that Jake could still make out the same limestone bluffs from Walt Hendricks's back porch that he used to see from a job site a decade earlier, back when the two of them worked the same crews and trusted the same numbers. Walt answered the door in a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled, reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, and looked at Jake for a long moment before saying, "Took you long enough," like no time at all had passed between them. They sat at Walt's kitchen table, with 2 mugs of coffee neither of them touched. Jake laid out what he had: the mismatched signature, the vendor absent from every registered list, the date that refused to fit anywhere in the sequence. Walt listened without interrupting, the particular quiet of a foreman who has learned to recognize the shape of a problem before it finishes growing into one. "You still doing this the hard way?" Walt said. Not quite a question when Jake finished. "Checking everything twice before you'll let yourself believe it. Learned it from somebody." "Learned it from your own conscience, mostly," Walt said. "I just didn't talk you out of it back then, and I'm not fixing to start now." Then Walt got up, went to a hall closet, and came back with a cardboard box that had sat sealed for the better part of 10 years. Inside was a folder Jake recognized before Walt had even finished opening it, a duplicate of the original inspection report from the project that had ended everything he'd built. Walt had kept his own copy, off the books, because something about that old job had never sat right with him, even after the lawsuits settled and the rest of the world moved on without a second look back. "Same firm," Walt said, sliding a page across the table. "Different name on the letterhead. Same handwriting on the stamp. Once you know what you're looking for." They never actually stopped doing business. They just started doing it under somebody else's name. Jake stared at the page until the words started to blur together. 10 years, and the same signature had found its way back into his life, this time on a project with his own name logged in as supervisor. "If this checks out," he said, voice lower than he meant it, "it means the same people who signed off on the report that got my wife killed are signing off on Kate's foundation right now, today, while we're sitting here." "Then you already know what you have to do," Walt said. "Don't let them bury you a second time." Jake drove back into Tulsa with the folder on the passenger seat like it might slide away if he looked at it too long. He went straight to Kate's house instead of calling ahead some things needed a face across the table, and stood on her porch at 9 at night with 10 years of grief tucked under one arm in a manila folder. She let him in without asking why. One look at his face enough of an answer. He told her everything this time, not the edited version from the hallway weeks earlier, not the half-truth from over the drawings, the whole thing. The firm his wife had died verifying. The report he'd flagged and been overruled on by men who'd never once set foot on the site themselves. The settlement, and the confidentiality clause that had kept his mouth shut for years, out of law rather than choice. The fact that talking about it now broke no agreement at all, because public safety outweighed a private contract every single time, and he'd needed somebody to say that back to him before he could believe it himself. Kate listened with the folder open on the table between them, and when he finished, she didn't reach for him, didn't offer him a sentence built to make the weight lighter. "Thank you for trusting me with it," she said instead, plain, no performance in it. All of it, not just the part that was easy to hand over. "Wasn't sure I would," Jake admitted. "Been carrying it alone long enough that carrying it any other way felt like it might not be possible anymore." "It's possible," Kate said. "You just did it." She picked up her phone and called the independent inspection firm the city kept on retainer for exactly this kind of emergency, and set a review in motion before Jake had finished his coffee. "If this is Dennis," she said, closing the folder carefully, like it was something that might still break, "I'll be the one who takes it apart, piece by piece, in front of everyone who ever trusted him." The board convened on a Thursday morning, 10 members seated around a table that had seen easier meetings than this one. The independent inspection results had come in the night before, and Kate had read them twice before letting herself believe what they actually said. Dennis arrived early, composed, already rehearsing the shape of a defense he'd clearly practiced in the car. When Kate laid the report on the table, foundation load capacity nearly 9% under code minimum, a certification stamp traced to an unregistered successor firm operating under a different name, he leaned back in his chair the way a man absorbs an insult rather than evidence. "This is a disgruntled contractor with a grudge against the entire industry," Dennis said, voice steady, practiced, building a conspiracy theory out of a paperwork error nobody bothered to double-check. Jake set Walt's folder on the table, without raising his voice at all. He walked the board through the load calculations himself, page by page, the same patient clarity he brought to every drawing he'd ever corrected on a rain-soaked scaffold. He didn't mention his wife. He didn't need to. The math carried a weight grief alone never could have. The independent inspector's voice came through the speakerphone at the center of the table, confirming line by line what the printed report already said, a deviation severe enough to demand immediate suspension of every affected phase, full recertification required before another cubic yard of concrete went into the ground. The room went still in the particular way rooms go still when a company realizes exactly how close it came to something none of them would have been able to undo afterward. One of the older board members, a woman who had sat on the founding board under Kate's father, finally broke the silence. How long until we'd have known, if he hadn't caught it? The inspector's voice, flat and unhurried over the speakerphone, answered before Kate had to. Depends on load conditions. Could have held for years, could have failed in a hard freeze this winter with people standing on it. Nobody in the room said anything for a long moment after that. Kate stood. I trusted a process I should have been watching more closely myself, she said, meeting every set of eyes at that table in turn, one by one. That failure is mine, not the failure of the man who caught it. She turned to Dennis. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending full investigation by the board and the city. Dennis's composure finally cracked, color rising fast up his neck, as security walked him out past a hallway of employees who had stopped pretending not to watch by then. He looked back once, at Jake, with an expression that had nothing left standing behind it to hide. Jake didn't watch him go. He was already gathering the folder back together, careful with the pages the way he was careful with everything that mattered. And it was Kate who noticed that his hands, for the first time since she'd known him, weren't quite steady, now that the room had emptied out, and there was nobody left to perform steadiness for. The site went quiet for 11 days, while the recertification crews did their work. Cores drilled and tested one by one, every prior sign-off checked against a name that could actually be verified against a real license. Kate spent most of those days in boardrooms and shareholder calls, fielding questions from people who badly wanted someone to blame and weren't always careful about choosing the right target. She didn't regret any of it. Not once, not even on the worst call, when a board member suggested, almost gently, that she'd let personal feelings cloud her professional judgment. She'd let a felt sense of wrongness override a paper trail engineered to look clean. She said that wasn't the same failure at all, and she said so evenly and did not apologize a second time to anyone in that room. Grace brought Kate a drawing one afternoon at the trailer. Unprompted, the way children hand over things that matter without quite knowing why they matter. A bridge, crayon bright, spanning a blue river between two green banks without a single crack anywhere in it. She didn't explain what it meant. She didn't need to. Kate understood it anyway, and kept it pinned above her desk long after the project was finished. That evening, Jake and Kate sat on the bank below the site, boots off, feet in grass still damp from the sprinklers, watching the water carry the last of the daylight downstream towards somewhere neither of them could see from there. He told her the part he hadn't said even to Walt, that the worst part was never the report being wrong. It was that he'd been right, entirely right, and it hadn't mattered. That being correct had never once been enough to keep his wife alive, and some nights he still couldn't tell the difference between grief and guilt, no matter how carefully he tried to separate the two. Kate didn't try to talk him out of either feeling. She put her hand on his shoulder and left it there, and the silence between them did more work than any sentence could have managed. You didn't fail her, Kate said eventually, quiet, not looking at him so the words could land without pressure behind them. You told the truth and the wrong people had the power to ignore it. That's not the same thing as being wrong. Jake didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had steadied. I know that most days. Just easier to believe it out loud, sitting here, than it is at 3 in the morning. Then call me at 3 in the morning next time, Kate said, and left it at that. Come back, she said eventually, watching the water instead of him, not as a supervisor, as engineer of record. Phase 2, under your own name this time. My license has been inactive for years, then reactivated, she said. You've clearly still got the math in you. You never lost it. You just stopped letting anyone see it. He looked at the river a long moment before he answered, the way a man looks at something he's finally decided, he's ready to trust again after a very long time of not trusting anything at all. The shareholder vote happened on a Tuesday, 7 in favor, 1 abstaining, the kind of margin that left no real room for a second guess afterward. Jake Sullivan, structural engineer of record, Phase 2, Riverside Commons, the paperwork felt strange in his hands, familiar and foreign at once, like putting on a coat he hadn't worn in years and finding it still fit. He filed the reactivation with the state licensing board that same week and signed his first drawing set in years at his own kitchen table. Late, after Grace had gone to bed, Kate sitting across from him with 2 mugs of coffee. Neither of them needed any more for the caffeine, just for the company of holding something warm. Grace found the signed sheet on the table the next morning before school and asked, without any particular weight to it, whether her dad was famous now. Jake told her he'd never been anything but her dad, and that seemed to satisfy her completely, which was, he thought, probably the correct amount of importance to assign the whole thing. The public announcement went out with local press in attendance. A folding podium set up near where the future footbridge would rise, hard hats traded for the day in favor of jackets against the wind coming hard off the water. Kate spoke about accountability and about second chances, without naming either of them too specifically, letting the crowd draw its own conclusions. Jake stood beside her, hands steady in a way they hadn't been in years, and didn't look away when a photographer asked the two of them to face the camera together. Grace stood near the front of the small crowd, waving both arms until Jake caught her eye, and for half a second before he found his daughter's face in the crowd, he found Kate's first, a small reordering. Nobody else in that crowd would have noticed at all, but Kate did, standing right beside him, and something in her chest settled quietly at it, like a level finally reading true. They walked off the platform together afterward, shoulder to shoulder, saying nothing at all, because some things had already been said the only way that actually mattered between them. A year later, the footbridge opened on a cool October evening, string lights crossing overhead in the same loose triangles as that very first fundraiser, in the water below, running clean and steady beneath new steel that hadn't existed the year before. Grace cut a ribbon sized for someone twice her age, grinning out at the applause like she'd poured every beam of it herself, which, in her own 9-year-old accounting of things, she more or less had. Jake and Kate stood at the center of the crowd, hands linked in plain sight of everyone, the way they hadn't quite managed to stand at the party where all of this had first started a year earlier. Walt had driven up from Jenks for the occasion, standing near the back in a clean shirt he clearly didn't wear often, watching Jake shake hands with the mayor's office with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd helped set something right and didn't need credit for it out loud. A reporter from the local paper, notebook already open, brought up the old rumor from that first fundraiser, the two of them standing close enough that people had talked. Hadn't they? Some of them still remembered it. Jake looked at Kate before he answered. The same look he'd given her that first night by the tent. "I told her once that people would think we're together," he said. Kate tightened her hand around his, not letting go even for the photograph. "This time I made sure they wouldn't have to guess." Behind them, the bridge held the last of the light, steady across the water, without a single crack running through it anywhere.